So yeah, algorithms of cultural transmission in songbirds. Algorithms is a set of rules, that are used to, or processes that are used to solve a problem. And I'm interested in, how things work. And in this particular case, I'm interested in vocal learning, and because it's a great model of speech learning. But today I won't just talk about vocal learning. I will talk also about two things, namely first about how birds, they transmit culture but not knowledge. So we have an artificial task I'm going to show you, and it's kind of interesting. We find that birds are not able to really communicate the knowledge they have, and you'll see. And then I'll talk about how culture is acquired. So the algorithm, the template matching algorithm of birdsong learning, we're going to challenge that with some experiments. Okay, so acquisition of knowledge, right? Imagine this situation: your daughter puts the knife in her mouth, and you would like her not to do this. So what can you do? You could tell her no, don't do it. But then it's not so clear as an instruction what exactly to do. The no, what does it refer to? Maybe she thinks it's your chocolate, so you would like to have it or something. I don't know. You could also just take the fork and, swipe the knife on the fork and then put the fork in your mouth. So you could demonstrate how to eat chocolate. And well, even that might not be exactly clear, as we're going to see. So I'm going to show you an experiment where we compare learning from experience and learning from observation. Okay, so it's really about knowledge that we are interested in, not like yesterday in empathy or pro-social behavior, but some kind of artificial knowledge. And I think the computer scientists have understood very well how to study this because they have machine learning. So I'm going to give you first a little crash course in machine learning. So suppose you have these data points and you would like to fit a curve, right? You'd like to model these data points. So if you have a curve like this, then you would say this is underfitting because the model is too simple, I think, for the data. If you have a curve like this, then you will say, well, it's overfitting. Now it seems to be too detailed. And you would think, yeah, maybe a good fit would look something like this, right? But why? Why is this a good fit? I guess the machine learners. The error is minimized by the green curve. Yeah. Yes, exactly. You have new data and it will fit better than new data. It will generalize better. So that is how we're going to test knowledge, right? So we're going to give birds some data, see what they do with it, and then when they can somehow solve it, and then we give them new data. And so we'll look at how two types of birds deal with new knowledge, namely the experimenters that learned the task and the others that observed the learning. And so how does the brain do this? I'm just jumping a bit ahead. So the brain has a fixed capacity, right? We don't have I guess, small models here and larger models there. So in machine learning, people use this technique called regularization, which makes the model look like the black one. These are tricks like, dropout or early stopping or outlier removal that make the models look like the black curve. Okay. This is just background information. So here's the task. So we have birds and we let them go into a perch, and on the perch there's a little detection system, and when the bird is being detected, we play 1 of 10 stimuli, and the stimuli S1 to S5, they are followed by nothing. The bird can stay on the perch, and the stimuli S6 to X10 are followed by an air puff that blows the bird off the perch. It's actually not a strong air puff. That one bird actually liked it, so it's a mild punishment. The training stimuli we just picked randomly from 1 day of singing of one bird. We take among the thousands syllables, we pick just a few tens and arrange them by duration, such that the stimuli S1 to S5 are short and the stimuli S6 to S10 are long. And then generalization, we did the exact same thing, but we picked a syllable from another day. Okay. And so why would the birds go back onto the perch? Well, because there's a social reinforcer. There's a little hole in the cage and the birds can see an observer. And in case songbirds are gregarious, they like to see each other and hang out. And so that's why the birds go back. Okay, so this is now a little movie I'm going to play to you. I hope I'm going to be able to start this. No, I'm not able to. Here. So you could see the bird in the back is able to escape the short stimuli and avoid the puff. So it is a competent bird. And so this is how birds behave. So in the first day on the left, you can see every blue dot is an escape to the non-puffed stimulus, and every black dot is an escape before the puffed stimulus. And below you see the cumulative probability of leaving, and they're roughly the same. So on the first day, the bird did not learn it, but after the last day of training, you could see there's more black dots here before the air puff, and so the cumulative probability also is larger. So the bird learned to escape before the puff. So you could see this is a go, no-go experiment, and the birds can do this. Another real thing we're interested in is comparing the learning of the experimenter that is naive, and then the observer that was first watching and then does the same thing. And we were kind of a bit surprised to see that whereas the experimenter took about 5,000 trials, most of the observers did it in the minimum trials is like 1,000, which is kind of the trials we needed to gather to get enough statistics. So most observers could do it right away. And now to go back to the questions of knowledge, what knowledge did they acquire? So we had now birds where we first trained with the stimulus S, and then we switched to the syllables from the other day. And first we looked at the experimenters, how they generalized their knowledge to a new set of stimuli, and then the observers. They observed one type of stimulus and then were tested on the other. Okay, and here, surprisingly, so the experimenters, they were almost all perfect. They did it in the minimum time. And the observers were as bad as naive. See, it took them about, on average, 5,000 trials, which is like the ones of naive birds. So what we learned from this is that observers, they learn rapidly, but they generalize poorly. And I guess this, if you take that to humans, is why your kids should do homework, not just go to school without doing the homework. It's probably the same principle. But for statistical learning theory, what this means, right, if you have model complexity here on the x-axis, and if your model is too complex, then you overfit. If your model is too simple, you underfit. Then we conclude that experimenting brings you down here to this point, whereas observation puts you up here. And what I really like about this experiment is that the experimenters and observers had the exact same stimuli, right? They both had the same number and the same kind of statistics of both the stimuli and the air puffs. The only difference was that the experimenters experienced the air puffs on their body, whereas the observers did not, right? So we are led to, conclude as a hypothesis for future work that maybe to experience the outcome of your actions, like, an aversive air puff, is something that regularizes your learning process, right? And I'm thinking particularly of dopaminergic or neuromodulatory neuron systems that project everywhere, because to regularize means just to put a ceiling on the amount of learning, right? If you think of simple regularization, which is just to subtract from your weight changes a little bit at every update. So I think there's a nice parallel between this and machine learning. We further looked at what exactly did the observers pay attention to, right? So we had a few control animals. So we had perceptual learners. These are birds that saw the air puff not being delivered against the experimenter. So they had still the same statistics. They heard the stimuli, they heard the air puffs, but they didn't see the consequence of it. And it turns out the perceptual learners did not learn when the observers, when they were tested as observers. So it's more than just hearing the stimuli and the air puffs. Then we had valence learners. These are birds that saw experimenters that were not competent, so they didn't learn it, either because they were not very fast learners or because we made the task a bit harder, a bit random, that they could not learn it. And they also experienced, some of them experienced a few air puffs, but when we tested those, they were actually the worst of all birds. So to just, see that this is an aversive stimulus. So it's not like aversive conditioning that we're dealing with here, because then they would have learned it. Then we had one more experiment because we saw that the birds, they tend to communicate, right? So these are examples where here and here and here we see calls that are being exchanged between the two birds. And so what we did, we devised some kind of a Skype for birds, we called it. So we put the birds in two separate boxes, acoustically insulated with a digital communication system that we could turn on and off. So we would just turn it off between the beginning of the stimulus and the air puff, so they could not communicate with each other. And we saw actually, yeah, they tend to call more often during unpuffed trials than during puffed trials. So there's potentially information in that. But now, yeah, did they learn or not? Yes, they learned. So the birds don't communicate. They don't learn from vocal communication. So what really they're learning from is from visual observation of a competent demonstrator, right? So the birds are not capable really of telling each other about what is the solution to the task. They just learn it from observation. So this is all I had to say about this artificial task. And now I want to turn to the natural cultural transmission task, namely the algorithm of birdsong learning. So birds, they learn to imitate. So people like to compare the first year of a zebrafinch's life, the first 3 months of a zebrafinch's life to the first year of an infant, right? After 1 year, the baby says the first word, and after 90 days, the zebrafinch sings a crystallized song. And both of these systems, they have a sensory phase where the bird has to listen to a song from an adult tutor, and then there's a sensory motor phase where the bird practices its own song and gradually arrives at a good copy. And so there was people that early experiments were to deafen birds. So if you deafen bird here, then they will not learn a good song. If you deafen birds during the sensory motor period, they don't not, learn a good song either. So they need to hear themselves and they need to hear others during this process. And let's look at one particular example here of a bird that sings like sub-song over here, which is very unstructured at 42 days post-hatch. And then gradually, as the bird approaches 70 days post-hatch, you can see the song is looks like a good copy here of the tutor song. And maybe I could just play a few stimuli like this. So here's an unstructured babbling of a zebrafinch. And at 56 days, it sounds like this. And the tutor sounds like this. Sorry, it's a bit loud. And of course, all birds sound different. Here's a sense of the diversity. Here's another adult. And another one. So since about Mark Konishi, who was the first really one of the first to really describe this song learning, people believe is a template matching process. So the algorithm that has been around since the 1960s is that when the bird is very young, it listens to, in the sensory phase, it listens to a song that gets somehow memorized in the brain somewhere. And then later in the sensory motor phase, the bird sings and with its motor area produces a song, and the song gets perceived as auditory feedback and then gets compared to the memory somewhere in the brain. And then if there's a good copy, then there's maybe dopamine released or some other reinforcement signal. So this is the idea that has been around, and we designed a few experiments to challenge this idea. We said, well, maybe it's not like that, maybe it's something else. And so we're testing the comparator algorithm by first showing that, auditory feedback is not absolutely necessary for all forms of learning. And then I'm going to show you song learning without a comparison, right? So I think we find some evidence that it could be different. I'm not saying this is wrong, but there's evidence for other ways of learning that I want to share with you. So the first test is really to look at the auditory feedback. Every textbook says, birds, auditory feedback is necessary. And my PhD student, Anya, she said, well, let's see. And she designed a cool experiment. And so before I show you the experiment, let me tell you that many people, they test song learning by in adult birds by just playing back a loud stimulus, for example, when the pitch is low. So here is a bird that sings on every day a syllable of like 2.2 kilohertz. Every dot is one syllable. And when you punish the low pitch renditions, then the bird will increase the pitch to avoid the aversive stimulus. And so my student, Anya, she thought, well, we could maybe try to do this with light, right? So she put the bird in a box and recorded the song, and whenever the song, the light was on, but whenever the song hit was a particular pitch, either a high or low pitch, then she turned off the light very briefly. And so here's an example where a bird sings a high pitch, and on low pitch, the light goes off. So we had also high pitch light off birds where the light goes off when it sings a high pitch. And so in hearing birds, when you do this experiment, then they don't like when the light goes off briefly. So here, this is the mean pitch on every day. And here, the gray area is when the light off is targeted on high pitch renditions. Then you could see over the course of days, the bird shifts the pitch down, and we also shift down the light off zone. And this in this other bird, like when you turn the light off on low pitch renditions, then it will tend to increase the pitch. So they're trying to avoid it. But surprise, surprise, so when she deafened the birds and did the exact same experiment, then the birds tended to like this stimulus, it seemed. And so when you turn off the light on the high pitch renditions, then the bird would increase the pitch. And when you turn off the light on the low pitch renditions in this other bird, it would decrease the pitch. So what you learn from this is that hearing loss flips the valence of a visual stimulus. And just the mere fact of starting this paradigm to turn on this kind of light conditioned stimulus, song conditioned light off, when you do this in hearing birds, then they decrease the tendency to sing by 17%. But when you do it in deaf birds, then they increase their tendency to sing by 80%. So it's really of a different valence. And the most surprising thing to me was that when you look at the learning, then it's extremely precise and fast. So here's a bird that sings this particular stimulus syllable over here, and when you turn off the light for a few days at this particular moment on low-pitched renditions, then it will just make this little increase over here just before the light off. So the bird changes its song on a very localized moment in time. And so this is similar what you find in hearing birds. And what is even more surprising, if you look at the speed, so typically if you teach hearing birds with white noise playback, then they will change their song by about a third of a standard deviation per day. But deaf birds using light change the song with more than half a standard deviation. So they're actually faster than hearing birds. So first of all, this shows that not all forms of vocal learning depend on auditory feedback. And for me, it argues also a bit, against the simple coevolution of the motor and sensory apparatus, right? Because birds did not evolve to use light to change their pitch, and yet they learn very, very rapidly. So I think it's an amazing feat of the brain. And it's also interesting, this idea of using feedback, visual feedback to teach deaf birds could be used as a form of therapy, right? Or to maintain the speech, for example, in humans. And so this is something that has been explored with by Nicolas and Catherine and their PhD student, Roland Manon. And so, yeah, you can read this up. It's an interesting avenue for further work. So, okay, we found now auditory feedback is not absolutely necessary. Vocal learning is more general, has more general underpinnings. But now, what about another test? Let's go back to this model over here and now test this idea. Well, does there need to be a comparison, or could there be something else? So with a theorist from Stanford, Surya Ganguly, we had the idea, well, maybe there could be a gate so that either the auditory feedback is on or the memory, but not both at the same time. So this is how this would work. So we can simply picture this as a simple system between an auditory brain area, a motor area, and a random generator. So in the first sensory phase, I don't know why it's doing this. I must be very popular in emails or something. So during an early phase, the bird hears a tutor song, ABC, and it stores a memory, maybe some synaptic connections among auditory neurons. And then when the bird sings in this sensory motor phase, then we assume there could be a random generator that drives variable song, and the auditory memory would be turned off. Right, the bird would just be busy processing the auditory feedback and learn an inverse model, namely how to connect the auditory consequences onto the motor causes that generated them. And then, if this works, then in theory, the bird would just have to recall the auditory memory, feed it into the inverse model, and out comes the motor program for the song ABC. Right? So this is a theoretical model, and it actually is such that the auditory area became now a motor area, for which now there's actually evidence in HVC. And there was no performance evaluation ever, because either the feedback was off and the memory was on, or vice versa. And so for those of you interested in detailed models, so the model that we propose is that the motor neuron, when it fires, it has an eligibility trace, like a calcium signal that decays in time. And when the auditory neuron fires repetitively after some delay, then there would be this kind of strengthening of the synapse by this amount over here, given by the eligibility. So, and what the neurons would learn is a causal inverse. And what we mean by causal inverse is the auditory neuron connects back onto the motor neuron that makes it fire via sound. So that's why it's called an inverse, like you invert the causal consequence, right? And you could use it, of course, to have an auditory target and then to find the motor command that is needed to imitate that. So there would be a very elegant way to solve the vocal learning problem. And so this idea was tested, by Nicola many years ago. So he said, well, the consequence would be that if I have a bird that sings ABC, and now if I look at the neuron that generates the syllable B, then the neuron would have to fire before that syllable. And if the neuron responds to the sound of B, it would fire after that syllable. So you could look at the motor latency, tau M, and you could look at the auditory latency, tau A. And if you add those two up, this would correspond to the loop delay, right? The time that it takes for the signal to go to the environment and back as sound. And this is the same delay that would be giving rise to this kind of peak in the cross-correlation function. If you take this spike train and this, and you cross-correlate them, you expect to find a peak at tau. So this was the simple idea. So the mirroring offset should be equal to loop delay, and the brain area to look for this is L-man over here. L-man is a motor area, part of a cortical motor area that connects onto the premotor neurons of the song. And if you lesion L-man, then the song gets very stereotyped. So this is kind of the variability generator that generates variability of the song. You could see when you inactivate L-man, look at the syllable C, and it's very stereotyped here. But when L-man is active, then C is very variable. Okay, so this is how it looks like. The bird sings a song, and this is a spike train of a neuron. And here is the blue is the song-related spike train. And then Nicola turned off the light and played back that song file to the bird while it started to either sleep or just be there in the dark. And he recorded these spike trains, and then he cross-correlated those. Here's another song, and he cross-correlated those, and he averaged all the cross-correlations. He also had, many other neurons and averaged over neurons And so here you get, one particular case. The black line is the cross-correlogram over here that exceeds some kind of shuffle predictor red at 50 milliseconds. You could also see another case where he took multi-unit signals. And when you look at all the population average, all the cross-correlation curves, then so he found there was a peak at 40 milliseconds. And 40 milliseconds is roughly this loop delay, because when you stimulate in L-man electrically, and you look at how long does it take to affect the song, then you could see 20 milliseconds later there's a change in the song. And so the auditory latency is also about 20 milliseconds. When you play back a stimulus in the silence, then the latency of the spike is about 20 milliseconds also. So if you add those two, you get tau, the model loop delay is about 40 milliseconds. So we conclude exactly as we expected. Actually, L-man neuron activity agrees with the causal inverse model. So it could be that birds actually learn the song in this way. And so we did a further test, test the role of offline learning. Right now we have such, I just don't know why it's doing this. Pardon? Oh, I know what I could do. I just turn off sound because I don't need sound anymore. Okay. Okay. I turned off sound, so hopefully it's not going to do it anymore. And so test the role of offline learning. So if there's an offline phase, can we somehow interfere with it? So remember, there's two phases. There's a sleep phase, actually no, during which there's no auditory feedback and no song because the bird sleeps. And you could take the auditory memory and feed it into the motor area to learn a motor network. And in the wake phase, the auditory memory would be off, but the bird would use the motor network to sing the song and just retrain the inverse. That's the idea. Okay, so we thought, okay, let's just perturb the sleep activity in the brain. And then the birds should not be able to learn if there is really some kind of, learning during sleep. And beautifully enough, birds, they actually seem to have this replay activity during song, so during sleep. There's an array neuron over here. Remember, that's the target area of L-man, these L-man neurons I just showed you. And these neurons, when the birds sing a song, they fire in this way. And when the bird sleeps, they spontaneously recapitulate some of this. So you could say, birds dream of their songs, at least from the perspective of RA. And then we found out, well, these kind of sleep replay activities, so here this is the instantaneous firing rate of one neuron in RA. This is actually driven from NIF. So if you inject GABA into NIF, then this stops. And if you inject GABA into NIF, also in HVC, it stops. So NIF is the brain area that seems to be necessary for all sleep-related replay, like of bursts. Okay, then we thought, let's just interfere with NIF in sleeping birds. So we had juvenile birds. We had them grow up in a box while they're hooked up to a cable. And so 2 hours per day, we presented a tutor. And we always did that when the bird was already being stimulated. But they were never stimulated during either the juvenile bird singing or the tutor singing. We did not want to interfere with online processes, only offline. So here is the song of either the bird or the tutor. We don't distinguish between them. Mostly, of course, the juvenile, because it's alone most of the time. And here's the stimulations. You can see as soon as there's a break in singing, there is stimulation. So we really kind of, persistently go after perturbing neural activity. And we had two types of stimuli, either weak single pulses, single 50 microampere pulses at 5 hertz, Poisson, or strong paired pulses at 300 microamperes at 10 hertz. So this is about 8 times the amount of current or charge you pass through the brain is about 8 times higher than here. And you can see the activity here is just mildly increased after stimulation, and here it's brutally increased, and then there's some kind of a gap in firing. And we had 3 types of birds. So we had the rest stim birds. Those were stimulated while not moving. Then we had move stim birds. Those were stimulated while moving. And then we had all stim birds that were stimulated all the time, except, of course, during singing. And we monitored the movement with a camera, a video camera, and we quantified the amount of change in consecutive images, pooled over the entire area over here. So we had a robust detector. And then you could see all three bird groups. They actually moved during the day. So this is the amount of movement. The yellow area is during the day. So they all moved during the day and they moved less at night. So first we were worried that this stimulation would be brutal for birds, that it would be some kind of driving them crazy. But if you look over here, the green curve over here, these are the rest stim birds. These are the birds that are stimulated while they rest. They actually moved less. So they were not trying to avoid the stimulation. Maybe they even liked it. They, didn't move to get more stimulation. So we were not so worried after this. And so this is the amount of stimulation they got. The hourly stimulation fraction, so the part of the hour that is stimulated during night, the all stim birds got lots of stim, and then of course less during the day. And so you could see, of course the black all stim got the most, and then the red and green, the move and rest stim birds got less. And so this is song development in a control bird that does not get stimulated. So when you start tutoring it every day, then after 2 weeks or so, they learn a good copy. So the similarity is about 80%. And now in the weak stem birds, so we could see they actually also learned the song during a short period of time. They had a good similarity. And it turns out that they even were faster than the control birds. So this is the number of days with stimulation. Song similarity, so you can see the red is above the black, the control birds. And all bird groups seem to be learning, so it doesn't matter whether you stimulate all the time at night or during the day. It seemed to somehow accelerate song learning. And the strong stimulation seemed to slow down the learning over here, or maybe suppress it even. So you can see the curve over here is below the control birds without stimulation. And also here, it didn't make much of a difference whether you stimulated at night or during the day. So all the birds learned more slowly. Okay, so a summary for this experiment is so weakly stimulating the replay generated during non-singing periods accelerates song development, but strong stimulation slows down the development. So maybe, also daytime and nighttime stimulation was similarly effective. So maybe there's a random spontaneous neural activity is setting the learning speed. You can slow it down or increase it. But now, is this evidence for offline auditory memory consolidation? I think it's a bit unconclusive because, we found similar effects in old bird groups. It seemed that the strong stimulation was not just suppressing activity, it was overriding with something else, and that might have caused the effect here. So the better way to do this experiment would be with optogenetics and maybe silence the neurons. But we never did this because this is challenging enough to do such an experiment over such a long period of time. We looked now at another type of data. We looked for evidence of overnight consolidation by testing this idea that overnight there's some kind of memory transfer somewhere in the brain from one place to another. And so we looked for this process over here, but not really looking at the brain, but just in the behavior. Is there evidence that in the morning the songs are different than in the evening, and are they either better or worse than the evening before? And so the analysis methods that we used is to look at all the vocal output of a bird. So every point over here is one syllable of one bird in its entire lifetime. So this is like 500,000 points. And you can see when the bird is very young, the syllables lie here in this UMAP plane, in this embedding plane. And you could see now, when you take one particular point and the nearest neighbors, you could ask, well, are the nearest neighbor actually from the same period of time, or are they from the future or the past? And we use this to say either this syllable rendition is either, it's a regression or it's an anticipation, right? To make this more clear, so here's 3 syllables, all produced on the same day, 70. For this syllable, the nearest neighbor were produced at day 50. And for this syllable, the nearest neighbors were produced around day 70. And for this syllable, around day 80. Right? And we look at the histogram from when the nearest neighbors were. So this is really characteristic. So this is really, most neighbors are from earlier time. And here, most neighbors are from a future time. So we call, this is a regression, that the bird sounds a bit like a young bird, which he isn't. And this is a typical syllable, and this is an anticipation. This is like already sounding like a mature bird, where it isn't. And now you can do this analysis over all syllables, over all birds, and you get this curve over here. Pay attention to the red curve over here. This is on here is the age at which the bird produced the syllable, and here this is the neighborhood time. Like what is the time of the nearest neighbors? And here this is the red curve is the typical syllables, and you can see the typical syllables. Obviously, they are at the same time as they are produced, the neighborhood time. But when you look very carefully here, averaged over all days between 60 and 70, right? You could see here in the evening and in the morning, next morning, it's on the same level. It's not like, you know, the next morning the birds are better or more mature or less mature. They really at the same point in time. So we find there's no overnight consolidation in learning. So they're really seems to be more of an online uh, process. So there's not much room for offline learning. And this also aligns with other types of work where people tested explicitly for offline learning and find no evidence. So, and now to the last experiment. How many more minutes do I have? 4 minutes? 3, 4? Okay. So one test also of the inverse model hypothesis: can birds instantly recall a target, right? All humans have inverse models, I would say, because I could say a word you have never heard, and you could instantly imitate it. You don't have to practice. So you can, you know, wire or map the auditory features onto the motor structures. So we tried very hard to get birds to take, you know, when the birds sing, for example, here, this is pitch, they sing this particular, in this range of pitch, we tried very hard to make them sing another pitch, a much lower pitch. And we never really succeeded. I can show you all these crazy experiments we did. So here is a bird that we shifted up in pitch, and then typically with this white noise, and then when you let them go, they normally recover their original song. But here we muted them, so we made a small hole into their trachea for a few days, and then when we closed it, we wondered, well, maybe could they recover their original song, which they have been singing their entire life, and they were just, you know, pushed away for a few days. And here's one bird, and you can see we pushed the bird up the syllables pitch, but the bird did not recover. When we unmuted it, the pitch was almost up there. So, and this is, you know, whereas the control birds, they recover the original pitch very rapidly, the muted birds, they just don't go back. So birds cannot recover their song while muted. Also deafening, when you deafen birds, when they shifted, they didn't fully recover. So here's a bird we shifted down, and then it didn't recover the song. It didn't go back to the original pitch. It stayed, the pitch stayed down there. And yeah, you could see this is the statistics. Although when you look at the statistics here, you see there's a little bit of recovery. So here is the original, the shifted song, and this is the recovered song. So they were somewhere in between. So they recover a little bit. So we looked at, do they actually shift the pitch towards baseline? Do they just maybe not recover it fully, but go a little bit back? And then so we had the experiment where we look at birds that were shifted and then deafened, and then birds that were first deafened and then shifted with light, to see whether birds can revert the song, whether they need this mismatch experience or not. And so here's a bird that was deafened, and you could see it recovers a little bit. And so you could see, if you look at all the birds, 0 means no change. You see all the birds after a few days from recovering from the surgery, they sing a pitch that is towards baseline. So they revert a little bit. But when they shifted with light, so when they had no mismatch experience, then on average, there's no change. Some birds shifted up, some down, so they seem to drift. So it seems that the target mismatch experience is necessary for reversive pitch changes. And here's more the statistics, like all the birds that were shifted with light, they did not recover a little bit, and the birds shifted while they were hearing, they recovered. So you can see birds can actually revert pitch towards baseline. They don't recover baseline, but they can go towards baseline. So what birds can do then is this is kind of more or less the last figure. So if you have a bird that sings up here in this particular range of pitch, then they can plan to change the song in this pitch. So this is the range of the inverse model. This is the range within which they can make changes to their songs. But if you ask the bird to change outside of the range of their recent experience, then they cannot do it without sensory experience. So birds can plan, or they can invert their sounds within this kind of experience, or within their daily practice range, but outside they need really experience. So birds need sensory experience to recover a distant motor target. So birds can plan pitch changes within the extent of recent sensory experience, and the sensory experience is necessary for recovering a target. Okay, so to conclude, so there is a price, to learning from observation. It's poor regularization, so experience is important. Then we show that song learning without performance evaluation is possible as a hypothesis. And we find correlative and causal evidence of song inverse in the basal ganglia. And we find no strong support for learning during sleep, even though there is probably mechanisms of motor consolidation that need to be further studied. So yeah, I'd like to thank all these people that helped me in this amount of work. And so yeah, particularly grateful to Anya, who has been working with me for many, many years. Thanks.